Good evening, everyone. My name is Carl Gunther. I'm a professor here in the history department at the University of Miami. My job tonight is to introduce our speaker, but before that, I've been asked to make a few announcements about upcoming events that the center is going to be sponsoring and hosting. First of all, I'd like to let you know about the first Henry King Stanford Distinguished Professorship of the year. It's going to be next Thursday night, October 7th at 7 p.m., an evening with Valeria Luiselli. You can go to humanities.miami.edu and you can register for that there. And then the second upcoming event is the next book talk in this series of book talks, and that's going to be 2 weeks from this evening on October 13th. Professor Robin Walsh from the Department of Religious Studies here at the University of Miami is going to be speaking about her book, The Origins of Early Christian Literature, Contextualizing the New Testament Within Greco-Roman Literary Culture. So with those announcements out of the way, let me get on to introducing our speaker for tonight. It is a cliche to say that a speaker needs no introduction, but I hope I can be forgiven for doing that tonight. Those of you who regularly attend events organized and sponsored by the Center for the Humanities already know Hugh Thomas in his role as the center's director, a position he's held since 2018. He was also a professor of history here at the University of Miami, where he's taught since 1988. In our department, Hugh is a popular teacher, he's an exemplary colleague, and he's an outstanding mentor to graduate students and faculty alike. Alongside all of this, he is also an influential and very productive scholar. Hugh is the author of 5 books on the history of medieval England, and the quality of his scholarship can be seen in the many highly competitive fellowships that he's won from the National Humanities Center, the Davis Center at Princeton University, the ACLS, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and that's naming just a few. Hugh has been a Cooper Fellow in the College of Arts and Sciences, and in 2017, he was a Fulbright Fellow in the United Kingdom, where he was also a visiting professor at King's College, London. Hugh is not only a first-rate scholar, he's also a very wide-ranging one. He was a skilled social historian, and his first book was a detailed study of the Yorkshire gentry, or as he calls them in the excellent title of his first book, Vassals, Heiresses, Crusaders, and Thugs. He was also an outstanding cultural historian, having written extensively about ethnic identity and processes of cultural assimilation in his second book about the English and the Normans after the conquest. His 2016 book about the English secular clergy is of obvious interest to anyone interested in the history of religion, but one reviewer called it essential reading for anybody interested in political history or cultural history of medieval England. In short, Hugh's scholarship always reveals and clarifies the complex interrelation between different aspects of medieval life, and his most recent book is no exception. It is about both power and pleasure, court life under King John, 1199 to 1216. Please join me wherever you are in giving a warm virtual welcome to Professor Hugh Thomas.
So I'll slip momentarily into my Director of the Humanities Center hat just to welcome you all back to our new season of book talks. We have 11 this year. So I hope you will join us for more of those. I'll now turn to the topic of tonight's talk, and I'll start with sharing a slide, which has a quote. So, King John was a very bad man. The writer, the anonymous Abetun, goes on to talk about some reasons why he's a bad man, one of which I'll talk about later, but then says, but he spent lavishly. He gave plenty to eat and did so generously and willingly. People never found the doors of John's hall barred against them, so that all who wanted to eat at his court could do so. At the 3 great feasts, he gave robes of plenty to his knights. This was a good quality of his. So overall, John was a bad man, but good at certain things, including giving fancy feasts and distributing fancy clothes at them to his supporters. Now, there's been a lot of work done on John, in part because of his many failures. He was a particularly ineffective king, but even more so because those failures often had big consequences. So one of the things he managed to do was lose most of his family's holdings in France. This is a map of the conquest of his nemesis, King Philip II of France. John's reign was only 1199 to 1216. But basically, if you look at the red on the map, which is the land his family held, this is kind of a before and after picture of John. He inherited what you see on the left, that half of France at the time. And when he died in 1216, he held the far southwestern corner. Perhaps even more famously, what was the result of a major revolt against him at the end of his reign. I'm speaking here of Magna Carta, which is very famous for its role in English history and ideas about government and how it ought to be run and so forth. So John has received a lot of attention, but not much has been devoted to his court, to life at his court more specifically, which I'll be talking about here. And in the first half of my talk, I'll discuss the book in general and what its aims are. But then I'll turn in the second half to a very specific topic, namely John's sexual aggressiveness towards elite women and the disastrous consequences this had. So the book as a whole is designed at its sort of base level to reconstruct court life under John. For a long time, history of royal courts was considered kind of frivolous, sort of thing you might look at a show on BBC for or read in People magazine about what Kate and William are doing. What you really want to do, particularly in traditional English history, is look at administration and military and politics and institutions. But for European history as a whole, one important figure was a German scholar named Norbert Elias, who made court history respectable by making some big arguments, which aren't widely accepted anymore, but got the ball rolling. He argued that early modern kings helped establish their dominance over their nobility by drawing them to court and showing off in court and so forth. And in doing so, kind of tamed them, civilized them with consequences for these, what he called the civilizing process for Western culture as a whole. And so, as I said, lots of debate about this, but power, the discussion of power in particular, made the study of courts respectable, no longer just sort of People magazine kind of thing. And so there's been a lot of studies for early modern courts and then some for late medieval courts. My focus is more on the Central Middle Ages. And one of the things that brought me to this project is there's a real jump in administrative records in King John's reign. And although the records remain a lot less full than for later periods, there's still a lot one can learn. But there's another sort of strand in this, which is that anthropology has been very important for medieval historians of the early and Central Middle Ages in terms of thinking about things like hunting and feasting and material culture, not just as sort of unimportant, frivolous things, but as things that mattered in society. So in a sense, I'm drawing from those two historiographic trends, moving the study of one particular court to an earlier period. But a lot of the work that's been done on this, the early and Central Middle Ages is kind of, let's have a book on hunting in the abstract with anecdotes about specific kings. And I really wanted to pull all these kinds of things together to give a holistic picture of one court, to look at how court life and power worked in one place, and in particular to talk about one king's use of soft power and his successes or failures in that. To give the game away, I might say that John was about as successful with soft power as he was with hard power. It's not very, but it's a little bit more complex. To talk about hard power for a minute, John had a very effective government by the standards of the time, and it was he and his government were very good at building up a military machine, which John led to battles which he generally lost. And similarly, as you could see from the Anonymous of Autun, the government gave him the money to build up this really impressive court, to be generous, kinds of things that would buy noble support and impress people. So he was very good at that, but he then frittered that away through his personal relations. And in the second half of the talk, I'll discuss one aspect of that in more detail. In reconstructing in thinking about this and reconstructing court life, though, I want to focus not just on power, as the title suggests. I also want to look at pleasure. So as I said, power makes the study of courts respectable, but quite frankly, a lot of what's going on is very powerful people, including, or especially kings and rulers, siphoning a lot of money off from poor societies, sucking money away from very poor peasants to have very lavish lifestyles, which they could enjoy. So thinking about power, thinking about pleasure, and also thinking about what might be called contestation. So not just how John used his court, but how his enemies, and not just other kings, but rebels, used the kind of symbolic language of power against him. So a good example of this sort of combat over soft power has to do with hunting, and particularly with the king's control of forest and deer parks. The kings of England were the envy of Western Europe because they had these really big forests they controlled. They had really big deer parks with native deer, but also deer imported from the Mediterranean. They had a lot of hunting. And when the Anonymous of Autun wanted to show or to prove his claim that John was the most powerful king in Britain since Arthur, he said, you know, the deer in John's realm, when you come near them, they're not afraid. They sort of trot away if you get too close, but they're not going to run. The sense being that John was so powerful, his power to protect his deer was so great that he kind of had control over nature. And the barons understood this when they revolted against him. So when the barons gathered to rebel against John as they were coming towards London, on the way, they systematically entered deer parks and forests and slaughtered all the king's deer to say, no, we have the power, you don't have the power. So there's several layers in which I'm doing this. In reconstructing court life, one of the things I want to do is look at the difference from later courts. And so I'll just give you one obvious example. In later courts, rulers did move around. A big early modern ruler would have maybe 3, 4, 5 great palaces. One thinks of Versailles or something like that. Kings in the early and central Middle Ages were on the move, and John in particular. So he moved on average every 2 or 3 days. The longest he was ever in one place during his reign was a siege for about a month, but generally he moved every 2 or 3 days. And on average, including the days at rest, he moved 13 miles a day with his court. And so to give a good sense of this, this is a map put together by the French scholar Fanny Madeleine about the different places that John stayed. He would have stayed a lot more in France if he hadn't lost all his family possessions there, most of his family possessions there halfway through. So he's stuck in cold, rainy England. But you get a sense he's just all over the map, literally. And a lot of those places where you see the big circles, he stayed there a lot. It's 2 or 3 days at a time. So this means not a lot of heavy furniture, but instead investment in textiles, jewelry, and that sort of thing. And so just to give you a sampling of the things I talk about, textiles, we know from the records that commissioned lots of rich clothing with fur-lined cloaks and embroidery with gold thread. Unfortunately, we don't have the illustrations from his reign, but this is a picture of his sister, Matilda, and her husband, Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony. And so the clothing styles were a little different in Germany, but it gives you the sense of the lavishness of their clothing. The feasting that the anonymous at Bethune talked about don't have any one menu, but lots of different orders sent out. These are a sampling of some of them for different Christmas feasts. I want to call your attention particularly to the last item, 200 pickled pig's heads. Pickled pig parts were a great delicacy. But more is the volume of fish, animals, of spices. I mentioned the big hunting establishment. So at one point, there's an incomplete list of his hunting dogs, 458, nearly 100 men in charge of the dogs. Again, the lavishness is mobile. You have these poor old dogs trotting all around England from forest to forest. A lot of court life was actually on the road. So you would have ceremonial entries, and this became a practice going into the early modern period. And here's some purchases for one of these, not just horses, but saddle blankets dyed with Kermes scarlet dye made of the insect eggs from the Mediterranean, or spurs and reins gilded with gold leaf, or hats with peacock feathers. So I talk about all kinds of things in this, about feasting, hunting, and so forth, but about entertainment, learning, gambling, castles, palaces, the landscapes around them, really try to give a broad view, including things like chivalry and so forth. And so that gives you a sense of the overall book. I'm going to stop sharing. Actually, no, I'm going to keep sharing. I'm going to turn now to the more specific area that I'm talking about, which is John's relationship with sexual relations, excuse me, with noble women. And here I should raise a kind of problem with the term pleasure. I also use self-gratification because pleasure has pretty positive connotations, and self-gratification is more neutral. And at this point, I should probably note that some of the things I'm going to be talking about in this second section are pretty unpleasant, about sexual violence, among other things. So I do want to give that warning. And one of the nice things about Zoom is if you don't want to hear about it, you can drop off quietly. But one of the things I hadn't thought so much about at the beginning of the work, but pretty clearly pretty soon became important, was the political impact of John's sexual relations with noble women. So John, we know, had sexual relations with a number of women besides his two wives. And as yet unpublished paper by a scholar named Ralph Turner shows that he had at least 10 illegitimate children. We used to think it was 8. And some of these relationships with noble women were with noble women. So for instance, one of his children was with the daughter and sister of successive Earls of Warenne. I might note she was also one of his first cousins. So there's pretty clear evidence of a lot of activity outside of marriage, including with noble women. This was far from unique, certainly not in his family, but among medieval kings in general. So for instance, one of his great grandfathers, well, his great-grandfather, who was King of England, Henry I, had 22 illegitimate children that we know about. And again, in many cases with noble women. But for whatever reason, this was a much bigger political problem for John than for other kings. And that's what I'm going to explore here. We know this because in the decade or so after John's death, we have a number of writers who summarize the reasons why John's nobles hated him so much. And they all gave various reasons, some seen again and again, some not so often, but just about every one of them mentioned his sexual relations with a noble woman. And so I'll go back to the quotation from the anonymous at Bethune, and in this and others, I'll be highlighting the relevant ones, although you can see again that there's various reasons. But John was too covetous of beautiful women, and because of this, he shamed the high men of the land. The poem of William Marshall, this is a biography of one of John's chief supporters. William had a tempestuous relationship with John, but during the Magna Carta revolt, William Marshall was his chief supporter and later the regent of his son. But this is talking about why earlier the Norman nobles had turned against John, gone over the French king, and a couple of reasons, the second of which goes like this: that was nothing if he, John, caused shame concerning men's wives and daughters. He did not pay 2 pennies of compensation. The Waverley Chronicle, a monastic chronicle, among other things, he violated their wives and daughters. Roger of Wendover starts off with saying, talking about the nobles whose wives and daughters, with them grumbling, the king oppressor out. I'll come back to that verb because it's important. I've given a few possible translations, but it's clearly by context sexual. Well, we'll see, but it's clearly sexual. And then one that I discovered, and I'll say that in scare quotes because it was a source that was published, a fragmentary source published a century ago by a French scholar, but never really came to the attention of the scholars of John's reign. This is a fragment of a history of John's great nemesis, Philip Augustus, talking about the origins of the Magna Carta revolt at the end of his reign, the various reasons, and saying that when John got back after trying to reconquer his French territories and being kicked out by the King of France, gets back to England and says, then he acted worse than before and slept with their wives, daughters, and relatives, either by force or by other means. So clearly when contemporaries or near contemporaries in the decade or so after his death thought about the reasons for rebelling against John, one of the big reasons they thought about was, again, sexual relations with noble women. But this really is not emphasized in modern histories. And to give you a sense of this, there were a bunch of biographies and works on Magna Carta that came out in the year of the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. And so I'm a couple pages devoted to John's sex life and some snippets from one of these biographies. Kings, like other mortals, had sexual needs. John certainly sired a number of illegitimate children, possibly as many as 8, and he was notoriously predatory when around the wives and daughters of the barons. The production of illegitimate children has given many modern historians, many still languishing under the delusion that our hang-ups about sex are the same as those held by our medieval ancestors, the opportunity to heap opprobrium on the heads of monarchs who bedded women other than their wives. So here John's predatoriness, and it's described as that in that manner, is framed primarily in terms of modern moralizing, not medieval politics. And overwhelmingly, when historians discuss them at all, John's sexual activities are viewed as an issue of morality, of personal behavior, along those lines. Most historians tend to include his sexual activities among a bunch of sort of generally bad behaviors that made John unpopular. But the emphasis in studying the noble opposition to John has been on taxes, confiscation of land, military incompetence, and kind of governmental and administrative and military matters like that. Now, I should say that there are various reasons for the avoidance of the subject. Some, I think, perhaps more reasonable than others. The evidence around this is particularly complex. There's kind of no single smoking gun. Some of the evidence, which I haven't included here, is very problematic. But I think overwhelmingly, overall, the evidence is pretty clear. Another factor is that Magna Carta itself makes no mention of John's sexual aggression. So if you're going to study the reasons for Magna Carta, maybe you skip it. But given the chroniclers, I don't think we can do that. And it's not really a surprise that that Magna Carta wouldn't mention it, because this is theoretically, or it's issued in John's name, even though he's forced to do it. And sort of on the surface, it's him generously granting all these points of contention with his barons out of the goodness of his heart. You're not going to get him to admit to these kinds of things. And indeed, what Magna Carta covers is points of debate between the king and nobles. And whatever kings actually did, nobody argued that it was okay, that it was good for the king to sleep with the wives and female relatives of his barons. So it's not the kind of thing that would be in Magna Carta. There's other sort of, I think, legitimate reasons. But I think also that this avoidance of talking about politics is revealing about modern historiography. One factor for a long time was the desire to avoid the moralizing of Victorian era historians, such as one very famous historian, an influential historian, William Stubbs, by the way, Bishop of Oxford, who was not shy about bemoaning the moral shortcomings of medieval kings by his own 19th century standards. So a lot of 19th century historians were not moralizers. We're going to avoid those things and talk about serious stuff like bureaucracy. But you'd think by the 21st century, we might be, shall we say, being over the Victorians. Another factor is discomfort in talking about these kinds of matters. I certainly feel uncomfortable talking about it, but if it's important to understand what's going on historically, we can't avoid it. I think though the main thing is that the sex lives of kings has not been seen as important historically, except when it comes to producing heirs. It's just the kind of thing, like court life in general, you might kind of push off to the side as being more the stuff for tabloids, not for serious history. But clearly, as we've seen, a lot of writers at the time thought that it mattered a lot politically. I'll digress for a moment to say that most, if not all, these writers, and by context, we can be sure even the anonymous ones were most, if not all, male. So we don't, unfortunately, have much evidence at all on what women thought about John's particular actions. Although it is worth noting that John's first wife, Countess Isabella of Gloucester, whom he discarded when he became king, although he kept her lands, joined the rebellion at the end of the reign. She had various reasons, obviously, but one wonders. In any case, to John's male contemporaries, as well, I would guess, as his female contemporaries, John's sex life, as I've said, mattered. Now, I should note that I was drafting this section of the book at the height of the Me Too movement. And in many ways, that focused my attention on these issues. And of course, as historians, we have to be wary of anachronism, of letting contemporary attitudes distort our understanding of the past, of taking too presentist approach. But in this case, I think contemporary events help me to see past recent historiography to an issue that John's own contemporaries were waving red flags about. But of course, the barons of Magna Carta were certainly not proponents of some medieval Me Too movement. So what bothered them, especially since other kings seem not to have faced a similar backlash, at least not on the same level? There were, of course, the church's religious strictures against adultery and fornication. One factor in modern historians' attitudes is kind of rejection of those, along with Victorian attitudes towards sexuality. There's also a tendency to just, sometimes justifiably, to discuss clerical writers as being prone to exaggerated moral attacks and indeed hysterical slander when it came to expressing their views of contemporaries and their religious condemnations of them. But of the sources that I noted above, 3 of them were actually written in vernacular French, the language of the nobility at the time, for the nobility. And 2 of them were by writers close to nobles who actually supported John. So this is not simply a few clerical moralists running around screaming, or running around being moralizing in a way that nobles would not. This is something that it seems mattered to the barons as well as to monks and bishops. So I think probably religious strictures mattered somewhat, but as I said, there was not a backlash against other kings. So what about issues of consent and sexual violence, things that are so important to the way we think about them? And of course, one of the things that's increasingly clear in modern discussions is just how complex the issue of consent is, especially when you're talking about power relations. So even though you're talking about noble women, relatively powerful women, you're also talking about the relations with the most powerful man in the kingdom and a notably ruthless one as well. So consent, of course, gets very complicated there. And I think actually medieval people could think along those lines. But because this was a patriarchal society, they tended to think about these issues in narrower terms. When they thought about consent or lack thereof, they tended to focus on the use of violence, in particular in forcible coitus. So can we see that in the discussions of John? And here I think the evidence is a little bit more complex, although still pretty strong. So I'll go back to some of the quotations. The Waverley Waverley Chronicle, excuse me, also called the Waverley Annals. Their wives and daughters he violated. Violation, the Latin could refer to violations of religious or social norms. It could also, though, refer to sexual violence. Roger Windover's quote, I'm going to come back to this verb, but I'm going to start with another Latin verb, another Latin word, raptus, from which our modern term rape comes. But in the classical period and the medieval period, it's more ambiguous because in some senses, its core meaning is abduction, particularly abduction of woman, which could often involve rape, but could involve abduction for marriage, and that too could involve rape, but abduction against the consent of parents, but could involve elopement. So it's kind of tricky for medievalists when they think about these terms, this term, but it's also apparently tricky for some medieval people, because at least in 12th and 13th century England, when they're talking about violent rape, when they're talking about forcible sexual coitus. They use this verb opprimo, the root for oppressorat, meaning, among other things, subdued, overcame, seized, the adverbial phrase devi, with force, with violence. So here Roger uses the verb, but doesn't use the adverbial phrase. There's certainly going to be at least echoes of force, I think, here. Fragment of the history of Philip Augustus, which hadn't really been discussed in the literature on John before this book, is much more clear. By force or by other means. Also, though, as a biography of John's nemesis, extremely biased. But everybody was biased against John, so it's kind of hard to distinguish that. I'm also going to throw one of the more problematic sources in. This is a romance written about a historical figure, one of the rebels against John, whose sister John probably had an affair with, although the romance doesn't mention it. But here, talking about why John was hated, talks about his sexual relations with women. A noblewoman says he would entrap her by promise or gift, or ravish her by force. So again, a very clear idea of the use of force, but in, I have to say, a very problematic source. There is also in the Anonymous Abetun a claim by one of the leaders of the Magna Carta Revolt that one of his motives for first going into exile in France was John's attempted rape of his daughter, who was also the wife of another leading rebel. So maybe not a smoking gun. And I have to say that whereas historians often talk about a preponderance of evidence, for this kind of thing, they seem to have a sort of evidentiary standard that you expect in a modern trial that has to be guilty beyond a shadow of a doubt. I think certainly the preponderance of the evidence is that John was employing sexual violence. But this raises, but there's some issues that have to be pursued further about this. So one of the things you may note about this is both this quotation and the previous one talk about rape, but they also talk about other things that don't involve the use of force, that involve gifts. And we do have records of John making gifts to mistresses. And maybe one could say there is a sense that it's more than just about force, that deception, power matters. Unfortunately, it could also be that consent didn't matter as much to them as it does to us. And in some of the other quotations, the issue of consent doesn't come up at all. Ruth Karras, who is probably, well, I think definitely the leading expert on sex and gender in the Middle Ages, notes that for a lot of medieval writers, again, most of them male, the issue of consent just doesn't come up. So I do think that sexual violence was an issue here. I think it did matter some, but it's not the only thing, and perhaps not the most important thing. So what else mattered? Shame and honor. He was too covetous of beautiful women, and because of this, he shamed the high men of the land. That, and one corollary of this is that sexual relations, including rape, involving peasant women would not have been an issue. So what's an issue here is with noble women. It would not have been an issue politically, maybe for religious thinkers, but not politically. The issue here is for noble women, and a big issue is that he's shaming them. And I note in the book that probably for some of these noblemen, even when it was involved rape, they probably saw themselves as much the victim as their female relatives, because their honor was being affected. Now, in the poem of William Marshall, you have this very odd phrase that John did not pay 2 pennies of compensation. And again, modern sensibilities differ. What? It's okay if the king shames you as long as he pays you off? And probably was a certain crassness in some cases. But there's also a sense in which compensation of more than 2 pennies shows that you matter, shows that the king takes you seriously. And I think there are a series of things that kings could do to make it sort of okay for the families of women he might have sexual relationship with. And I mean, one thing is they could get good connections that way. And part of that would be getting favors. Part of that, though, would be, in a sense, being shown honor at feast, having high positions, and probably also the king being discreet. And what this suggests is John didn't bother with that. We know in other contexts that John could be quite cruel to powerful people, and that he could publicly humiliate them. And it really wouldn't be much of a surprise if he flaunted the shame that he imposed on some of his powerful nobles by his sexual relations with their wives or female relatives. One of the, one of the more striking, I want to turn here, I guess, in sort of wrapping up to how this fits into the larger arguments of the book, how this particular section. And throughout the book, I talk about sort of to what degree is the court designed to build power? To what degree is it designed to bring pleasure or self-gratification? And obviously, it's a lot of both. And obviously, power was a factor, and contemporaries recognize this. But here we have John recklessly alienating a lot of his nobles at court through his actions. And I think this should remind us not to think only about power, but to think about, or to think not only about the building of power, but the loss of power and the uses and abuses of power. I think it should also remind us that power in this society where it was concentrated in the hands of a few depended a lot not just on wealth and armies, but also on personal actions and personal relations. According to yet another hostile French writer, John's illegitimate half-brother, William Longsword, Earl of Salisbury, who'd formerly been one of John's strongest supporters, turned against John at the end of the reign because John had had sex with his wife, while William had been in French captivity after being captured leading the English forces on John's behalf at the Great Battle of Bouvines. So perhaps John was simply taking advantage of his half-brother's absence, but perhaps he was humiliating him for not winning the battle, while John was in a completely different part of France, accomplishing nothing. In building up soft power, John's government was actually pretty competent. In this, as in other matters, however, John himself was a disaster, as well as being, to quote the anonymous of Bethune one last time, a very bad man. Thanks, and I appreciate your coming and listening to this talk. So now I guess we'll turn it over to questions. I should note that I'll actually ask Carl to come back online. The best way to answer questions in this kind of webinar setting is to go to the Q&A session We actually have one other question there, but you can type in a question at any time. Since there's only one, I'll start with this one, but maybe Carl can help me keep track of them. So this is actually from Meg, our wonderful assistant director, who unfortunately moved back to Richmond, but says, thanks for an interesting talk. I'm just wondering, considering that these women with whom John was entangled with noblemen, surprised that we don't have diaries or personal letters from these women that would give us insight. And based on what you know about this time period, would they have been hesitant to commit their experiences to paper, or were these types of documents less likely to survive? Or perhaps I'm just overestimating how many noble women were educated enough to write. So there's various factors in this. Women who wrote tended to be nuns, but women did have access to literacy, had people who could write for them. Unfortunately, we don't tend to have many letters or diaries. We don't have any diaries from court. We have letters, but they tend not to be about these kinds of things. But yes, these were things that people tended to keep a lid on. So one of the problems in kind of gathering evidence is that families who are affected by this would tend not to talk about it. So I think it's a whole range of things.
Shall I relay the questions to you?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
So we have a question here from Pam Hammonds, and she asks, how were women viewed in relationship to property rights during this time period? Were they treated, in fact, if not legally, as property of their fathers or husbands, etc.?
So not precisely, but in sort of a quasi fashion. So one of the big issues in Magna Carta that was in it is that one of the ways kings raised revenue was by selling off the marriages of heiresses and widows. And the idea behind this was that nobles were supposed to provide support to the king in warfare, but as women they couldn't do it, and the king wanted to make sure these heiresses were married to faithful people, but sometimes they would just have them essentially married off to the highest bidder, who are often seen as low-class people. So there was there was that kind of quasi property very much in thinking of people. But a flip side of that is the idea that you shouldn't do this, that they weren't property to be married off, that they're not like serfs, where you couldn't sell peasant women or peasant men in the way you could sell slaves, but you could sell their property and they had to go with it. But with noble women, that would be problematic.
All right, we've got another question here from Amina Gautier. She asks, I'm just curious if Prima Nocte, things like that come into play in conjunction with John's sexual violations and the humiliation of his high men. Were all the women he sexually violated, including the daughters and sisters of his barons, all already married?
We don't know that they were necessarily all married, because a lot of them we just, some of the kids we don't know who their parents were and so forth, so we don't know that. For those of you who don't know, Prima Nocte, which is something, well, the idea is that with serf women, the Lord had the right of marriage of sleeping with the wife on the marriage night. So this is a big factor in Braveheart and so forth. And I taught this in my first 2 years, and then an article came out that said, nope, it's all a myth. So there's these kind of odd bits of evidence that said, payments are coming for marriage from peasants because sometime, a long time ago, this happened. But there's not any solid evidence that it did happen, even though it's sort of big in historiography, and until a few decades ago, people took it quite seriously. So yeah, and as you say, even with noblewomen, that wouldn't be the case in this situation.
So I'll jump out of order here, but just Pam has a follow-up question to her earlier one, which was, would rape be seen as theft?
No, and that is in a sense, going back to raptus, to abduction, there's not exactly property theft, but it is abusing the rights of the parents, their right to sort of control marriage. One of the interesting things is that one of the few areas that women could testify independently, as opposed to having to have their husbands testify, were in cases of forcible coitus. So in that sense, there is kind of a sense in which in these situations women have autonomy.
All right, we have a question here from Steve Cronin. That's, did John's womanizing, his raping, does it grow stronger after the Magna Carta in compensation, or is he sort of cowed by this and become less aggressive, or did people perhaps feel more confident standing up to him after Magna Carta?
Well, so what happens after Magna? So Magna Carta is towards the end of his reign, and I'm trying to go through quickly so I didn't give the whole picture. So when the barons rebel, they grab London. John is sort of forced into a corner. He issues Magna Carta. They squabble for a while theoretically enforcing it. Meanwhile, he sends messengers off to the Pope to get the Pope to allow him to break his oath because it was forced on him, which the Pope, who at this particular moment is happy with him, obligingly does. So within a few months, it goes back to civil war. Interestingly, what one of the French writers says is this sort of a thing at the end of this reign. So after he loses a final battle in France in 1214, but by the ages of the children, this is something going on all along. It's kind of hard to distinguish this particular behavior in the after Magna Carta versus before, although given it was in the middle of the war when norms sort of went out the window anyway, it wouldn't surprise me if it got worse, but that's just a guess.
So I have a question of my own for you. It's a slightly different direction, but sort of related to some of these circumstances. I'm just curious about how space worked at John's court. In the sense, is the king often alone? To what degree is there any privacy at the court? Is John meeting with certain people sort of privately, but others in a group? How is he sort of encountering all these people, and are they ever alone, really?
So that's a really good question. And it also comes up in thinking about all these courtly love stories about adultery and so forth. Privacy was not a big deal. John would have people sleeping in his chamber. John would have people around him all the time. One of the things they spent a lot of money on, interestingly, was sort of not just sheets and blankets, although those could be heavily embroidered with gold thread, but the curtains around the bed. Mm. Partly that's because the bed is during the daytime can be a public space, but it may be also that you got your privacy by having curtains around the bed with people sleeping in the room. But none of this is going to be completely discreet. Now, interestingly, John's father, for one of his mistresses at his great palace at Woodstock, had some formal gardens that are now under a lake. But one of the buildings next to a water feature then was called Rosamond's Bower in a later document. after his mistress. So there may have been places the king could go off to, probably with a few men standing around keeping guard. And certainly in the romances talks about couples being in chambers privately. So maybe when sex was going on, courtiers didn't sleep in the room. They sort of came in after. But yeah, it's a good question. We don't really have good answers to that, or certainly I don't.
It's one students always ask too.
Yeah.
So we have another question here from Amina. Do we know if John's sexual violations against noble women interfered with any of his barons' ability to produce heirs and successors? That is to say, had any of the married women with whom he sired illegitimate children already provided their husbands with heirs, or was that part of the humiliation?
So, yeah, I mean, one of the big issues, of course, for sort of strict rules that were enforced on women was the issue of having heirs. So from the church's point of view, adultery by males and females was equally wrong. But in social norms more generally, it was a complete double standard. And so noble men could get away with anything. So yes, definitely, I mean, we don't know particular cases, but that's one of the things that would have been a real problem for the men. And one of the issues is, yeah, is your son maybe the king's son rather than your own son? So the sources talk about this so briefly, as you saw from the quotations. This has to be inference, but I think it's a pretty darn good inference.
Yeah. And presumably it also creates spiritual affinities with them too.
Yes. Not that seems to have bothered John much at all.
Yes. Not worried about the canonical niceties, I imagine. Well, seeing no more questions, shall we wrap up, Hugh?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's verging on 9 anyway. So I guess I'll slip back into my role as director rather than presenter. So thanks to everybody for coming. And I guess I'll say this also as presenter. For a lot of you, this is pretty far outside your field. So I really appreciate you coming to hear about medieval history. But I hope you will come to a lot of other book talks by our great colleagues. So until next time, we'll bid you good night, and I hope you have the good rest of the evening.